Do la parola adesso alla dottoressa Baslandze, che presenta una ricerca molto interessante, che non è una valutazione di impatto, ma è una ricerca molto ambiziosa perché cerca di capire gli effetti, una delle cause presunte, diciamo, del rallentamento della produttività in Italia, e se questa sia causata dalle connessioni con la politica / burocrazia. Prego.
Thank you so much. Slides. So thanks for this opportunity to present here, and thanks a lot for the opportunity to work with this amazing data set that gave rise to many questions and highlighted lots of new interesting facts about the Italian economy. And one of the projects that works with this data set is our project, which is Connecting to Power, Political Connections, Innovation and Firm Dynamics. This is a joint work with Ufuk Akçigit from the University of Chicago and Francesca Lotti from the Bank of Italy, who is present here. So in this project, we try to understand what is the interplay between political power on the one hand and firms and industry dynamics on the other hand. In particular, we want to understand what is the effect of firm-level political connections on firm and industry dynamics, aggregate productivity and growth. Well, there may be different channels through which connections affect aggregate economy. You would think that in a heavily regulated and bureaucratic country, if political connections help to alleviate these bureaucratic frictions, then this may entail some static gains for the economy. But on the other hand, there may be other channels, more dynamic channels that are also important to take into account, which could have more aggregate, more also long-term implications. In particular, through rent-seeking, resources are getting misallocated, competition is often repressed, and new dynamic firms are not able to compete on the same grounds with connected incumbents, and incumbents also don't have innovation incentives because they have secured market positions for themselves. So, and there has been lots of public discussion about the possibility of rent-seeking in explaining the soaring competition across the developed countries and soaring productivity growth. Though you hear lots of discussions of this kind, it is not still clear how pervasive this problem is and how these political connections translate not only into private returns, but more aggregate returns for the whole economy. So this is the question that we want to understand on the example of Italy. So how do we proceed in this project? So first, to answer this question, we construct a new illustrative theory of firm dynamics and political connections. I will not bother you with too much details, but I will give you 5 minutes intuition in the next slide about the static versus dynamic gains or losses for the aggregate economy from the rent seeking. So we construct a brand new data set that became possible because of the VisitINPS program, and I will talk about it. Then we take this huge data set and we provide empirical analysis both at the micro level and also at more macro level. And we try to sharpen identification strategy for some of our micro level results using new data on marginal election outcomes. All right, so step by step. So let's start from some illustrative model to build a quick intuition. But before that, I want to mention a little bit about the channels through which political connections may directly benefit firms. So they could be through bureaucracy, removing bureaucracy or regulation costs, like think about licensing permits, the paperwork that politicians help you to overcome, or they can help in terms of accessing the credit better, or more popular explanation for the procurement and public demand. So in this particular model, we will focus on the regulation/bureaucracy cost, broadly speaking. Why? Because it is clear that it is empirically relevant, and it is a common obstacle to businesses in Italy. While there are lots of ample anecdotal evidence, also based on the different World Bank indicators, we know that Italy stands among the last among developed countries in terms of the regulation and bureaucracy that firms are facing. And in addition, we provide our own empirical evidence where we show that those industries that are more regulated and face more bureaucracy actually also the ones that rely more on political connections. And it's not just Italy. Public discussions are about other countries as well, and there has been new empirical recent evidence on the US that rent seeking has been becoming more important for explaining higher corporate profits. But having said that, the modal trade-off is not specific to this particular and can be generalized more specifically. So just 3 slides very quickly, hopefully in 3 minutes, to build a bit intuition and then to proceed with the data and look at the data through the lens of the model. Let me tell you that it's a simple model of firm dynamics and growth, and firms could be incumbent firms or new entrants, and they decide on innovation, which improves the productivity in the economy, and they also decide on political connections. So here, entry and innovation are engines of the productivity growth. So if there is no entry and low innovation from incumbents, the economy is stalling. However, there are frictions in the economy. At each point in time, firms will face some regulation, bureaucracy costs that we model in terms of production wages, and political connections will help to alleviate these frictions, but come at some cost. So let me give you quick predictions from this model. Let's consider what we get from the static problem. What is the static problem? It's a choice of getting connected and production choice as well. So firms compare clearly static benefits from lowering the wages, getting rid of regulations, to static costs of connections. What comes out very naturally is that there is a cutoff of the size of the firms, after which firms will decide to get connected with the politician because it is beneficial to get rid of regulations, and they can also incur this cost, while before the cutoff they will not be connected. So as a result, the prediction 1 is that large incumbents are more likely to get connected. Prediction 2 is that after getting connected, connections lead to higher employment, sales, and profits because they just remove those basically production costs, but not necessarily labor productivity. So in a way, the model highlights a two-way causal implications between size and connection. So larger firms are the ones that are getting connected more, but then after you get connections, also resources are get relocated to you even more, though you are not necessarily the firm that is more productive. And the last intuition that I want to bring comes from the dynamic problem. And dynamic problem is that dynamic problem is when firms decide on innovation decisions and also on entry into new markets. So in a frictionless economy, the entrant, if it has a superior technology, it is a more productive firm. It should be able to replace existing incumbent. But what will happen here is that if entrant is facing a connected incumbent, then it will be harder for entrants to take down those incumbents. As a result, incumbents will also anticipate and preempt entry by connecting early. So if you remember the static cutoff, now even smaller firms will want to connect to politicians because they want, in addition, to preempt entry and competition. So as a result, we face lower reallocation if incumbents are connected, and hence connected firms will survive longer. Notice that there are no artificial barriers from politicians in terms of entry. This is just an endogenous response of the economy to the unequal allocation of benefits across firms. So prediction number 4 is more aggregate. Industries with more connections will face lower entry rate, as we said, and will have lower productivity and lower growth, both because of lower entry, but also because incumbents will be less innovative. So to summarize, statically connections will reduce frictions, but dynamically markets are dominated by older and larger firms, resulting in lower reallocation and productivity growth. So this is the intuition that we want to bring to the data and try to understand how much of it we see and what can we understand in the data for Italy. So the key part of this huge data building process is the social security data from Inps on the universe of private sector employment. So there are two components that are important for us, individual level and firm level. For the firm level, basically, we're able to see universe of firms and understand the firm dynamics in the economy. We connect it with the balance sheet and income statement data, in addition with the patent data, in order to understand even better the innovation behavior of the firms. At the individual level, we're able to connect it with the register of local politicians. So why do we do that? So in Italy, as we know, the local politicians at the regional, province, and municipality level are also able to work in private sector while they hold office. So this link will be exactly the link that we're exploring in terms of defining our connection measure for the firms. So basically, we will have information on the position, attributes, party affiliation of politicians, and in addition, we bring in new data for the elections, where we can also identify marginally contested elections for later analysis. To define once again, so connection will be basically based on the contemporaneous employing politician when the politician serves in the office. High-rank connection will be the same if the firm is connected with the mayor, president of a region or a municipal or a province, vice mayor, vice president, so like key individuals. And we also distinguish between majority level connection if the firm is connected with a member of a majority party at the local level. So first, let me just quickly summarize what we get out of these matches. So connections are quite widespread. Across industries, they account for 4% of all firms, but among large firms for 44% of them. And as a result, it accounts for almost a third of employment across industries. So if we look at the time trends, so for example, on this panel, we have share of connected firms over time. You don't see much fluctuation. The scale is very low. The only dip that we observe, temporary dip, is in early 90s, in the period of so-called money politique, where we had where there were lots of corruption and nationwide investigations into bribery cases. We see a temporary slowdown in connections, which amounts here in about 9,000 firms in the economy, but there has been a revival quite quickly. If we look at the share of high-rank connection firms, which means to key mayors and the key individuals, we see that from the First to Second Republic, there has been some kind of a regime shift in the sense that there has been more reliance on high-level connections. In terms of the industries that are most connected, we see that pharmaceutical, airlines, waste, water, utilities, telecom, public administrations, those industries are more connected. Now, let me summarize the stylus facts such that I don't run out of time and you don't know what we're talking about. So first, we want to think through the lens of the model as well. So what in the model we're showing is that actually the market leaders and larger firms are the ones that have high incentives to get connected, but they also are least innovative in the economy. So indeed, what we see is that market leadership is associated with higher political connections, but lower innovation intensity. As well, we observe that connected firms are less likely to exit, and connected firms experience higher employment and revenue growth, so resources are getting reallocated towards them, but not because they are also growing in terms of productivity. And we try to make progress in terms of the causality on these results using the regression discontinuity design. And finally, at more aggregate level, we observe that industries with more politically connected firms have lower entry and a higher share of connected entrants. As well, those industries are populated more by older firms. The average growth rate and productivity is also lower. So let me start with the first evidence on rent-seeking versus innovation. So Consider a particular market and think about the market in this particular example as at the level of industry and region in particular point in time. And let's zoom in into top 30 firms in terms of their employment share. So let's rank the firms based on their employment. So here we will denote top 1 firm, top 5 firm, and so on, top 30 firms. And we look at the politician intensity, which is basically politicians per labor, per 100 labor here. And what we see is that market leaders are the ones that are most intensively connected with the politicians, and there's almost linear declining relationship in terms of between firms' market rank and politicians' the intensity. So what happens if we look at the similar picture for the innovation intensities? Well, we observe a completely opposite picture where the market leaders are the ones that are least innovation intensive, and this is just one measure of innovation, which is patents per labor, but also what we observe that the quality of innovations that leaders are doing is actually lower. So as a result, we have this kind of disconnect between rent-seeking and innovation by size and employment firms rank in the market. So the next evidence that we bring is about the survival analysis for the firms with different connection status. So here we just plot couple major survival, so basically survival probabilities for the firms up to some age on the horizontal axis. So the blue curve here denotes the firms that have never been connected. The orange are those that ever get connected, but never to a high level, and ever connected with high-level politicians. So what we see is that, for example, the survival probability by age 10 is very different between firms that are connected at some point, but they have never been connected here. And if you do more detailed Cox analysis, conditional on different observables, conditional on size, we see that connections lead to a relative decrease by 8% in the exit hazard rate, and high-level connections are much more powerful, and they lead to 25% exit hazard rate decline. So let's look what happens in terms of the connections and the growth of the firms. What our model, for example, says that there are different, through the removal of these frictions, firms are now able to grow more. So indeed what we see here, I will not talk about all of the numbers here, so let me just guide you a little bit. So we look at the outcome variable, which is employment growth of the firms, and we conditional different observables and also the fixed effects of the firms, and we look at the relationship between connection status and also connection with the majority party member on the employment growth. And indeed what we see that connection is associated with the firms that are more connected have 3 percentage point higher growth, which is quite large given that the growth of the firms in Italy is very low. So connection with majority gives additional little kick to that. And this is same for the revenue growth. However, what we observe in the similar regression is that connections are not associated with productivity growth, either if we measure it by labor productivity growth or TFP growth. If anything, it is associated negatively with productivity growth. Okay, so though we try our best to condition on different observables, we still, of course, have issues in terms of identification. So we wanted to do a cleaner analysis to identify that at least causally there is a link between connections towards growth. So what we do is that we use a regression discontinuity design here. In particular, we make use of sharp discontinuities caused by local elections decided on a thin margin. And the idea is to compare firms connected with politicians right before the marginal election, and we compare firms that are connected with marginally winning versus marginally losing firms, politicians from a marginally winning or losing party or coalition. and we'll look at the evolution of the outcomes after the election. And the idea is that these close electoral races are determined by a chance. Think about breaking news or weather shock. So these elections cause the discontinuity, which basically lets us identify the effect of the majority level connections on the firms after the elections. So clearly there are various points about identification versus external validity that I don't want to cover too much. Massimo wants me to finish soon. Given that this is administrative data, and given that we have the universe of elections as well, there is really lots of variation that we can have. There have been 37,000 elections at municipality, province, and regional level, and even with the 2% victory margin, there are more than 2,000 elections at the local level. And with 5% margin, we're talking about more than 5,000 elections, and there's no particular concentration in terms of geography for those cases. So let me not go into the math right now, but try to explain graphically what the RD does. On this panel, we are looking at the outcome variable, which is employment growth right after the election, against the victory margin in the election. So here, the positive margins of victory denote firms that were connected with the politician, who won in the election with that victory margin. So, for example, if a politician won in the 48 versus 52% election split, then we will plot the firms here. And the negative victory margins denote losing firms. So we, for visibility, divide everything on the x-axis into 1 percentage point bins, and those points denote the average growth after the election in those particular bins, and the solid lines are the smooth polynomial fits from the corresponding RD regression. So if the regression discontinuity is valid and it generated a random assignment of the firms into treated and control groups, then what we would observe is that exactly at the margin, there is a discontinuity in terms of the outcomes for the firms. So indeed, what we observe that there has been large positive effect at the margin exactly, which translates for this particular sample to approximately 12 employees. So. However, we don't observe this similar picture for the labor productivity growth after elections. So, in a sense, this is just gives us additional confidence that though the model talks about two-way causality, that there is also the causal link between connections and firm outcomes. So clearly we do some robustness and validation tests as our standard for RD, but we will not cover them here. So finally, what I want to talk about is about the connections and industry dynamics, more aggregate features of the data. So on the left panel, we see the relationship between the entry rate and share of connected firms across markets, across industries in particular region. So here, everything will be conditioning on fixed effects of the firm, of the industries, regions, year, and also conditional on the size of those industries. So what we see that those industries that are more populated by connected firms also face a lower entry rate. But at the same time, conditional on entry, the entrants are also more connected, as is visible from this relationship. So in particular, if the share of connected firms in particular industry is higher, then share of connected entrants is also higher, maybe indicating that it's better to be connected yourself as an entrant to be able to fight with the connected incumbent. And finally, let me give you another relationship between the average employment growth and average productivity in the market as a function of the share of connected firms. We observe that in aggregate terms, those industries that are more connected are also populated by firms that are growing slower, that are larger as well, that have lower labor productivity. So let me so this is the recap of our stylus facts, and just to summarize, so we wanted to highlight the effect of political connections on the economy, that it has both static gains and dynamic losses that appear in even a very simple model. So we provide new empirical evidence on the relationship between political connections and number of micro and macro moments in Italy, and future work should quantify importance of these channels for aggregate productivity growth and welfare. Thank you.